Welcome back. Joining us in the studio is Associate Professor Andrew Jamieson, an archaeologist with extensive Middle East field experience in Egypt, Syria and Lebanon, Australia's representative on the SHIRIN International Committee for the Protection of Syrian Heritage, and a senior lecturer in Near Eastern Archaeology at the University of Melbourne. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Gemma, it's great to be here.
Firstly, can you tell us a bit about why you got into your field? What interests you about archaeology?
So, it goes back to the very beginning. I've always had a fascination with old things, archaeology, and particularly the archaeology of the ancient Near East. As a young child, I was given a book, I don't know whether it was for a birthday or for Christmas, on Howard Carter's discoveries of the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
And those evocative images, that great archaeological discovery, became an obsession, and it really has been a lifelong interest in ancient history and archaeology, and it developed into studies at university, and I was very, very fortunate. In the first year of my studies at the university, I was invited to go on an archaeological project, believe it or not, to Egypt. And from the first day, I absolutely loved it, fell in love with archaeology, and it determined my destiny. And for the last 35 years, I've been going back and forth to the Middle East and working on projects, as you mentioned, in Egypt, in Syria, and in Lebanon.
Yeah, so much passion, it's fantastic. So you've travelled to the Middle East countless times, as you just mentioned. What were the purposes of your trips to Egypt and Syria?
So as I mentioned, in that very first trip, it was to work on an archaeological project, a project in the Western Desert, one of the 5 oases of the Western Desert, Dakhla, and an amazingly rich archaeological region, and the archaeology there was producing some spectacular discoveries, and that was fabulous. And I went back and forth to Egypt for a number of years, and then in 1988 I was invited to join a new project that was developing in Syria. It was a salvage excavation in the north of Syria on the Euphrates River, and for the next 10 years, from 1988 to 1997, I was involved in those excavations at a site called Tel Akmar, and it was one of a number of sites that were going to be flooded as a result of the construction of a hydroelectric dam on the Euphrates River. And the University of Melbourne was one of many international teams that joined that rescue initiative, and we worked there for over a decade with those excavations.
What kind of sites and artefacts were you working with there? What time period were they from?
Well, in Syria, at the site of Tel Akmar, it was mostly from the Iron Age, from the first millennium. In fact, it was a capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And as soon as we sunk our trowels into the ground, just below the surface, we came down on elite residences from this first millennium Neo-Assyrian period, 7th century BC, and we exposed 3, 4, 5 houses, very well preserved architecture, walls up to a height of 2 metres, and within those buildings were the most spectacular archaeological finds.
Yeah, sure.
Carved Phoenician ivories, cuneiform tablets inscribed with correspondence, cylinder seals, life-size basalt statues, underground tombs. It was an incredible archaeological experience, and some really significant discoveries were made.
Yeah, how lucky you are to have been there. That would have been amazing to see. Is there any particular site other than that one or artefact that you've worked with throughout your career that stands out as one of your favourites?
If I go back to Egypt, very early on, I was there when we were digging at a site called Smint El Harab. It was a sort of Ptolemaic, late Roman period site. And in some of those houses, there were wooden books, codices, again inscribed with writing, in this case ancient Greek, and again incredibly significant because of the information that those artefacts like the clay tablets in Syria, those sources, the information those objects provide.
Yeah.
And Gemma, they're good examples because they highlight the importance of the archaeological process,
yeah.
and that process about discovering objects in situ.
Yeah.
That is, we can document very precisely the floor level, the room, the building, the site, the location of those objects. And that context, that in situ context, is what gives the objects their significance. And that significance is defined by that archaeological place that gives meaning and helps us interpret and understand and appreciate those finds.
Yeah. How would you describe the impact of the Syrian civil war on the country's heritage?
We know that in some cases, those sites have been deliberately targeted and destroyed because of the iconic status and significance of those places. Syria has at least 5 sites inscribed on the World Heritage Register. And whilst that listing is of course designed to recognise their importance and also through that process contribute to the conservation and protection of those sites by identification on that World Heritage List, they've attracted, in this case, unwanted attention. And we know that those groups have deliberately targeted those places because of their notoriety, and it's guaranteed publicity. It's a headline. It's a front page story.
Yeah. How does it feel personally to see footage of the Islamic State destroying ancient sites and artifacts in a matter of seconds?
It's devastating.
Of course, yeah.
It's very difficult to describe for someone who's worked in the Middle East and in Syria and visited sites such as Palmyra, where we've seen the deliberate destruction of some of those monuments. It's absolutely tragic.
Is there a way for these sites to be restored or better protected in the future?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
And in the chaos of war, it's hard to prevent the damage and the destruction. I think it's in many ways about raising awareness about the importance of these places, their cultural and historical significance. Often those local communities get overlooked in the archaeological process of excavation. And we as archaeologists have a responsibility to make the information about our finds available to those local communities as a way of including them in the cultural heritage interpretation and management. And I think I'm hoping that, you know, when the situation in Syria stabilises, we can return and resume that research collaboration. And I think we as a community of archaeologists have a role to play in being able to make our discoveries accessible to those local communities so they can feel part of the involvement in that cultural heritage.
Yeah, of course. Just lastly, before we have to let you go, do you have any trips to the region planned or any projects you're currently working on?
Of course. When it's safe to do so, we would very much be keen to return to contribute and assist with the post-conflict conservation and protection and restoration. And I'm hoping that the Australian archaeologists that were involved in Syria, and we were working there for 3 decades before the conflict started, that we will be able to go back and contribute to that restoration.
Yeah. I wish we weren't, but unfortunately we're running out of time. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise, and for the work you're doing to discover and protect the regional heritage of the Middle East.
Gemma, thank you very much.
When we get back from the break, we'll share some advice from a couple about the best things to see, do and eat when in Egypt.